All right. Welcome, class. Welcome my online class. Well, no, you guys are all in person. Welcome my in-person classes to an online version of how to complete your annotated bibliography um, project part 3. So basically, this is an assignment, obviously, that you all have been working on this semester for quite some time. You've done part 1, which is the topic idea, part 2, which is the thesis statement that goes along with the topic idea, and now you are going to start finding sources for your annotated bibliography pieces that you've developed to this point. If you are watching this video, it probably means you're definitely means you're taking one of my classes, and it probably means you are either in History 104, 105, 327, 328, or 386, depending on which class you're taking at what time and what semester. This explainer works for all of those courses. The Annotated Bibliography Project is basically designed to be used at a variety of classes and a variety of levels, depending on what class you're taking it in. You may have 6 sources, 8 sources, or 10 sources that you owe for me. But basically, the baseline project is the same. The number of sources that you have to produce for the project differs. So the goal of this video, I'm hopefully going to be able to upload it to YouTube, will be to show you how to go through the process, how to write the annotated bibliography part 3, and most importantly, how to find the scholarly sources that are required to complete an annotated bibliography project, whether, as I said, that's 6, 8, or 10. The goal of this is to show you how to find all 6, 8, or 10 of those by researching within UofL's databases and within UofL's catalog to find the sources you need, to locate the sources you need, to summarize the sources you need, and then most importantly, when it comes to following and finding the parts of the project that need to be completed, how to do so, what it looks like, and how to follow more or less as a template an annotated bibliography project, whether it's for myself or for other professors who may ask you for something similar. The goal of the research side of this is to show you that by and large, for the number of sources you need to do, 6, 8, or 10, you can do all of those from UofL's catalog and from UofL's databases. Whether or not you need to actually show up and physically handle the items is necessarily up to you, but the entire process, research, discovery, and citation, all 3 of those important components can be done from the computer and from UofL itself, from your online access to these databases. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to walk you through part 3 that you're about to embark on. I'm going to show you, using a sample thesis I've devised to kind of give us some research tools, how to research that thesis. And then I'm going to show you what it looks like to actually put pen to paper, so to speak, and write up a summary of a single source so that you know what I expect to see in the annotated bibliography when I go to grade it at the end of a semester. The idea being essentially that you'll be able to use this video as a template to answer all the different parts of part 3 through the syllabus and guidelines I gave out at the beginning of the semester. So to that point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by sharing my screen, and we're going to look at the different parts of the annotated bibliography part 3 so that you can see what I'm talking about and what we're going to look for when we actually get into the database. So assuming I know how to do that, as someone who understands technology, I totally am that person. Let's see if I did it correctly. Yes, cool. Okay, so it shows that I am sharing my screen, and my screen should be looking at History 386's particular version of the annotated bibliography project. But as I mentioned, these are the exact same phrases and words I use when I assign this in 104, 105, or the military history classes 328 and 327. So we're all looking at the same paragraph is hopefully what we're getting out of this. So let's take a look then. Part 3 for your annotated bibliography requires: the culmination of this project will be a formal annotated bibliography of sources to prove the thesis statement you created in part 2. This piece is due April 28th, though obviously this probably varies depending on what semester you're watching this and what class you're in, and requires the student to identify, explore, and summarize 8 sources, again, depending on what class and what source you're in. Please read the guidelines carefully, that help explicate or prove your thesis statement. Each source identified should include a full Chicago citation of the item, not MLA, not APA. You've got to follow Chicago, but I'll show you how easy that can be. an overview of the source's importance to your subject, and how it can be utilized to prove your thesis. Each source description should be 1 to 2 paragraphs long. You should select only secondary sources, but can use a primary source with prior permission. All sources must qualify as scholarly sources. We'll pause here for just a second. Note the 2 important things here. Try not to use any primary sources unless your thesis statement directly plans to delve into primary sources as the piece of your thesis statement itself. You don't need them. All of the theses that you all have created and that I've already approved this semester are either well-known or partially well-known arguments within a well-known context of historiographical information. You don't need to kind of reinvent the wheel, so to speak, by looking at primary documents, because by and large, that would be the goal of the paper if you were to write a paper. Now, remember, for the love of Pete, I've mentioned this in class, I know I have no matter what semester, do not write a paper. You're just doing the annotated bibliography preparation for the idea that if you needed to, you could provide and create a paper for this work. So the goal is you're going to do everything but the paper, all of the prep work that would go into coming up with a topic, coming up with a thesis, finding sources that would help you prove your thesis. And then if you were going to, you'd be able to write a paper, but you're not. So remember, you're just looking for secondary sources, and those sources must be scholarly. This is the big trip up, and this is where over the many years I've been assigning this project, I've seen many students make a key mistake. They tend to not follow that very important word there, scholarly sources, scholarly being the key word. Far too often students take the easy way out, hop on Google, and just assume that whatever sources they find that mention their topic are somehow scholarly. This is not the case. Scholarly sources are required to be, as part of the research process and the publication process that faculty members go through, peer reviewed, i.e. that their peers have a chance to look at what they're writing about, critique what they're talking about, and then it becomes part of the general historiographical process for understanding sources. So what I'm going to show you today is how to find that key word, scholarly. And it might sound daunting, it might sound difficult, but it's actually quite easy. And UofL's databases and catalog make it extremely simple, both to find scholarly sources, as I mentioned, to cite them via Chicago, and to figure out what they're about without ever necessarily needing to physically hold the item. The other side of this is also very important. Excuse me. As I mentioned, what we're really talking about here, when we go to the research side of things, is finding stuff that will fit into what we're talking about, that you'll be able to summarize adequately, and that you'll be able to figure out how it applies to the thesis you're picking. How it does that and how well it applies is also part of the grade. So let's look at the second piece of part 3. This will essentially be repeated 8 times. You will find 8 sources, summarize essentially these 8 sources, and then, as we will see, dive into what it means to pick apart a source from an annotated bibliography's perspective. Let's look at the guidelines again. Grading for part 3 will include an assessment of each source and summary for the source selected. All these pieces of information should be considered in the paragraph summarizing the source, but the most vital of are bolded. Good phrasing, professor. I'm sure I will correct this in the next go around, but basically are bolded is what I meant to say. Correct citation of the source. You have to get your Chicago citation correct, but I'll show you how to do that nice and easy. Age, reliability, quality of the source selected. If you give me bobsburgers.com/Civil War files, it's probably not going to be high quality, and it's definitely not going to be a particularly scholarly source. That's going to hurt. So making sure that it's newer, i.e. that it takes in more of the historiographical context. Don't cite books that are from the 20s or the 30s or the 40s if there's something better that can be cited from the 90s, 2000s, or 2010s. Important information about the source, focus of the work, who wrote it, why it was written, etc. Bolded here for extra importance, why you picked the source, any unique or useful features of the work, how the source is important for your thesis, the source's place in the historiography of the subject, conclusions reached by the author of the source, how the source can be used to prove your thesis, or conclusions or observations of the source reached by you. This sounds like a whole lot of stuff. And frankly, it really isn't. There are a lot of pieces of an annotated bibliography that you can or can choose to ignore. But the most important part of an annotated bibliography boils down to a very simple question. How does this source help my thesis statement? When you're a historian, you're functionally attempting to prove an argument that you believe is the case about a historical phenomena or event. If that's the case, then you want to find sources that help prove you right. You don't want to find sources that help prove you wrong. So the goal of the annotated bibliography, whether you're doing 6, 8, or 10, is to find 6, 8, or 10 sources that help prove your argument. So the most important things that each one of your paragraphs needs to do, and you can do this in one paragraph per source, 2 paragraphs per source, however you choose to write it up, and I'll show you an example that I've written up to give you an idea of what I'm looking for. You must have what the source is about, a basic couple of sentences saying this is what the author of the source is describing in their work, what their central argument is, or at least what their central argument is as it relates to your thesis statement, and then most importantly, how would you use this source? It's not good enough to simply say, this is a book about the Civil War, or this is a book about World War I. It's about how does this book influence or prove your thesis? This is the key piece of an annotated bibliography, as I said. Summary, resourcefulness. What is it about? How does it help prove what you're writing about? If you get those 2 big things correct, using the other stuff in the guidelines that show you how to get that correct, you will find that you do very well on this project. The students who follow this next part, though, tend to do extremely well overall on grading, and that is about the level and quality of the research effort they put into the project. So what I'm going to show you now as the second part of this project, or second part of this video, and there's essentially 3 parts. One, we've summarized what the guidelines are. Next, we're going to do research, and then I'm going to show you how to transform your research onto the page. And what that means essentially is this: how to take the sources that you find in the research project, how to cite them correctly, how to describe them correctly, and how to show how they will be used to prove your thesis. If you follow this video and the things I'm talking about, you will do very, very well on this project. And students who follow this over the years have done very well on this project. So without further ado, let's get into the research side of things. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen and I'm going to start sharing this screen. Question, where's this going? There we go. Okay, so assuming I've done this correctly, which is always a big assumption when it comes to me and technology, just double check I'm doing that. Yep, okay. We should be looking at the main page of the University of Louisville. Hopefully by this point you have traveled to this page at some point during your UofL career. If not, I have a lot of questions for you. So, as I mentioned, and as I said was important to this part of the project, you're really going to want to use the University of Louisville's libraries, both their databases and their catalog, to help you find sources. One of the important things that's often misunderstood about an annotated bibliography is that you don't necessarily actually physically need to handle every one of the sources that you look at. Really, the goal of an annotated bibliography is to start gathering sources, not to start diving into them too deeply, to determine, to sort through, and to understand what you will be using were you to take that next step and actually begin the process of writing a paper. So when I say that you can do practically this entire project from your computer or from your chair, your laptop, however you want to do it, what I mean by that is functional and formal. All you need to do is to know how to access the database, how to manipulate the database in its search terms, and then how to transform that onto the paper in a way that will complete the guidelines for this project and any other possible annotated bibliographies. So without further ado, let's hop on to the UofL Library's basic pages. We'll start by going to Academics on the main UofL page, and we will click on Libraries under Resources. This is the main UofL Libraries page. We're going to get to know both it and a couple of its subsidiary pages in a couple of different ways. There's 2 main places that we're going to search today. This main big search box is for the catalog itself. It holds and accesses not just all of U of L's resources, physical or article database resources, but also any other items that are in WorldCat or World Discovery, which is a much bigger web of basically any information that any university libraries across the country have. So this is the big search box. It's not as intimidating as it might feel, and I'll show you how to use it in just a second. The other side of things we're going to be looking at is a way to just dive into the databases themselves. And that's under the quick tools where it says all databases A to Z. I'm going to right click that. We're going to come back to that one because, as I mentioned, if you want to, and I honestly encourage it, you can do practically all of your research from the big search bar. In a case like this where you're doing 6, 8, or 10 sources for a project of this nature, 8, 10, 6 books would be more than fine. And as I mentioned, if you do this the right way, you don't necessarily need to handle each one of these books so much as you need to be able to identify it in the catalog and figure out what the author is talking about. And as I'll show you today, that can be done relatively simply. So we'll start by with the basic searching. And I've clicked the advanced search bar to show you a few things. I'm going to run and I'm going to use our searches today from kind of a sample thesis so that I'm not doing anybody's work for them. I'm going to pick a thesis that I've seen, worked on, and find enjoyable myself in my own personal research in general. And I'll use that to show you how to do some researching. So I'm also going to pull up now. So I have it. Basically, I'm going to work from a very simple thesis today. And the thesis I'm going to write, I'm going to read it to you. This is the thesis that I say that I've just completed parts 1 and part 2 for Professor Goldberg. And now I'm trying to translate my thesis statement into the annotated bibliography. So here's my thesis statement. Think about yours now in this context. Thesis statement. The concept of the decisive battle has long roots in military history, but the actual decisiveness of battles and winning wars is often debated. This thesis will argue that despite the general ineffectiveness of major battles to truly settle wars, some battles in world history do indeed dramatically reshape political and cultural outcomes and can therefore be considered decisive. There's my thesis statement. When we want to translate or transfer a thesis statement into searching, the most important way we have to remember that the catalog does this for us and that we, in turn, influence the catalog is that libraries and library cataloging language are related to one another on the basic line that they are created by humans and that they are definitionally based on human language. So when we want to translate a thesis statement into search terms, we have to find the terms in the thesis or find the terms in our argument that will be easy to search in the catalog. For me, obviously, in this case, the obvious thing I really want to be looking into is that concept that I discussed, the decisive battle. So let's translate that into our search terms. Let's start very basically. When in doubt, we'll start easy. Decisive, spell it right, battle. Now I put it in quotes because if I put it in quotes, that means that these two words, which are the basic piece of my thesis, will stay together, so to speak. If I want to, I can kind of manipulate things by adding different operators, which we'll talk about briefly in a second. But basically, I'm going to start very simple. We're going to put in as a keyword, decisive battle. And I'm going to start searching for sources that will prove my point. So as I mentioned in the basic answer to this, or the basic line for my thesis statement, I'm talking about decisive battle as a historiographical concept. I want to know whether or not other authors have tried to argue that there are big battles in world history that are decisive in terms of outcomes of political history. If that's the case, what I really need to find are sources that talk about decisive battle on a broad macro spectrum. Talking about one battle or the other would mean that I really should have been writing a thesis statement about that specific one. Instead, what I'm talking about is finding something on the bigger scale, on the global historical scale. So if we look at our list here, we notice a few things. Already, based solely on this keyword, this very first search, our most simple search, we have 2,200 results in libraries worldwide. As I mentioned, we can find things based on book or by article. Right now, I haven't limited it, but if I choose to, I can limit it by a variety of things. U of L's catalog automatically searches what the library itself holds, what U of L holds. I can change that by a variety of limiters. If I wanted to, I could simply say whether or not UofL has it. I want the best match for my search term. I don't need to do that because I can already see that there's several things that at least mention what I'm talking about. I can also scroll to the format and limit it by a variety of formats. Since this is, as I mentioned, an annotated bibliography, I know I don't want videos, I know I don't want archival material, and I know I don't want audiobooks. I'm primarily looking for books. So I'm just going to go ahead and start with books here. If I wanted to, I could limit it by articles, but since we're going to look at articles in a different way later, I'm just looking for books. Now, we're down to 891 results worldwide. Hopefully, since I'm only looking for 6, 8, or 10 books, I'll at least find a couple in this 891 search results that'll help me out. So we'll scroll down and take a look. If we want, we can also continue to limit it. I also know, based on the fact that Professor Goldberg made sure to mention that it needs to be a relatively recent book, that I probably shouldn't find something from a long time ago because it wouldn't help the argument, and Professor probably wouldn't be very proud if I picked something from, 1920. So I'm going to go ahead and limit it just to the last 25 years for now to see if that helps me. Now, luckily, that's only dropped the number of search results to 700. That means I still need only to find 6, 8, or 10 sources out of 700. I hope at the very least for our very first and very basic search, I'll be able to find something useful. So let's scroll down. Now, thus far, what we're seeing in the first one, second one, the third one, the fourth one, we're seeing books about specific battles. Again, if I was picking a specific battle like Dien Bien Phu or Agincourt or Midway, that might make sense. But again, as I mentioned, I'm looking for kind of the bigger argument overall. Bannockburn, Salamanca, these are all battle specific. But this one looks interesting. What is this? The Allure of Battle, a history of how wars have been won and lost. Now that sounds interesting. I think let's take a look at this one. This one is clearly about more than just one battle. And so if I'm trying to find if this source will be useful to me, luckily the catalog does all of the legwork for me. If I click show more on the summary, a historian or someone else, probably somebody from a library or from a literature review process, has already summarized this entire book for me. Let's see if it's useful. History has tended to measure wars' winners and losers in terms of its major engagements, battles in which the result was so clear-cut that they would be considered decisive. Cannae, Königsberg, Austerlitz, Midway, Agincourt all resonate in the literature of war and in our imaginations as tide turning. But these legendary battles may or may not have determined the final outcomes of wars in which they fought. Blah, 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 blah. It's very clear this book is exactly what I'm looking for. It's a book that talks about the historical and historiographical process of decisive battle. In fact, the summary summarizes this very clearly. Cathal Nolan, his book, systematically and engrossingly examines the great battles, tracing what he calls short war thinking, the hope that victory might be swift and brief. As he proves persuasively, i.e. his argument, however, such has almost never been the case. Even the major engagements have mainly contributed to victory or defeat by accelerating the erosion of the other side's defenses. It seems very clear I found a book that will fit perfectly for what I'm doing. Not only that, the summary here has given me an overview of what's in the book, what biographical and information stuff I need about the book, and even most importantly, what the author argues. Basically, what I'm saying is, without ever having to move from my chair, in 30 seconds of searching, I've found source number one, I've found how to summarize source number one, and I found how useful it is for my thesis. It's very clear that Dr. Nolan is arguing that by and large battles are not decisive. But as we saw from my thesis statement, I'm not arguing that they are, simply that some indeed can be, depending on the cultural and political events that follow. Ergo, what I've decided and what I've determined is I have found the first source for my thesis that I need. So what do I do from here? Well, the great thing about the catalog that's changed over the last 20 years, particularly since I first did my research in grad school, is the catalog has been a lot better about one, summarizing sources for you, and two, starting you on the process of creating and finding how to do the kind of heavy lifting of the citation process. If I look here at this source, I have most of the basic stuff that would go into a citation. I have the year it was published, I have the publisher, I have the name, I have the title. If I wanted to, I could go find a dusty old citation manual and follow that to find the Chicago Citation Manual. But the great thing here, the wonderful thing here, is I no longer have to do that because the catalog does it for me. If you look above the title, you'll see a nice little button that says Cite. You click it, it will pop up this nice little green thing here. Select citation style. We're looking for the Chicago one. And since we're doing a bibliography, we're going to click Chicago Bibliography. And look at that. What it does for you is it generates the citation. So Professor Goldberg, who has required you to do Chicago citation methods for your annotated bibliography, has been totally and utterly worked around because the catalog has done it for you so that you don't have to do the heavy lifting. So all I need to do is copy that. You can either click copy citation or you can click copy. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen that I'm working from. I will paste it here. And so here is what your, so you don't see my nice wonderful summation. Here is the citation, or excuse me, here is annotated bibliography as you should be working through it. The basic stuff that your annotated bibliography part 3 should do. My name, or your name, I should say, annotated bibliography part 3. The thesis statement that you produced for part 2, boiled down and pasted at the top so I know and can review what you're doing, and then your source list, and you're going to do 6, 8, or 10 of these. Now, as we saw, I've already found my first one, and I've already cited it. So all I need to do to make sure this is done correctly, and remember, as you can see, there's italicized pieces here, so you got to be very careful about this. Do the nice, easy thing. We're simply going to copy and paste it and make sure that we merge the formatting. Delete this little extra bit, and look at that. Professor has been thwarted. I haven't had to do any deep, heavy citation lifting, but I now know that the very first source that I've selected is correctly cited, and I'm ready to begin the hard part of summarizing it and understanding it. Now, luckily, as we saw in the citation itself for the item, we'll jump back to the library page. Did I go back to what I wanted? Yes. In the generic citation for the page, we know that we have all of the important bits necessary for us to write this up. We know what the author is arguing. We have a summary of the book. We have basic information of when it was published, where it was published, and why it was published. We even have, if we scroll down a bit more, some of the other things that describe the book. All of this to us is very useful. If we chose to, we could certainly go check its access options, go track it down in Extreme Library where it says it sits on the 3rd floor in the book stacks, and physically hold this book and try and decide if we want to use it. But based on how detailed this summary is, we can probably already understand whether or not it's going to be useful. And so this gets us to the question and the big important part of the project that we're working on. How do we change this from the library catalog and put it on the page as a correct summary of an annotated bibliography source? Well, let's go back to our bibliography assignment and look at that. As we saw in part 3, there's a variety of different pieces that we talked about that tell us what we need. We need the citation, which we've just done thanks to the system itself. We need to know whether it's reliable, whether it's new, and whether it's useful. As we saw with the age, we've limited it to the last 20 years. It's a book from 2017, so we know it's age reliable. Is it reliable in terms of its quality? Well, it's from Oxford University Press. That's a really good sign that it's reliable. And then we want to know what the focus of the work is, why we picked it, and how it's important to our thesis. Based on the summary we read, we know all of this information. And so it's about then writing that out, putting it in our own words, and then adding how we plan to prove it. So let's go back to what I wrote as a summary of this source and try to understand how you will translate this to the sources you find. So I went ahead and wrote up a sample summary of this book to tell us what I'm looking for when I go to read your annotated bibliographies. Here is my paragraph. The Allure of Battle was written in 2017 by prominent military historian Capo Nolan. Nolan's work gives a general overview of a variety of battles across world history, from the earliest times to the end of World War II and a bit beyond. He surveys wars from every major period of military action to determine if any of them were truly decisive in the political or social context in which they were fought. In particular, he concentrates on whether the battles truly achieve the political goals the military leaders hope to achieve by armed force. Boom. I have summarized this source. I have checked off all of the boxes that Professor Goldberg has asked for in determining whether or not it's recent, if the person who wrote it is a expert in their field, and therefore what it's about. So in my first two sentences, I've nailed most of the main parts of a summary. Next, essentially, Nolan follows the Clausewitzian maxim that war is not merely an act of policy, but a true political instrument, a continuation of political intercourse carried on by other means. Probably want to add this little end quote there. To this end, Nolan delves into the history of the debate about decisive battles and even spends time defining how the term decisive can be used and construed in a variety of ways. However, he concludes that despite the general historical assumption that battles were and could be decisive, few actually were. So we've now summarized his argument, which we saw in the summary on the library catalog. We didn't even have to break ground by pulling the book off the shelf. The summary did all of the heavy lifting for us. This argument both contradicts my general thesis statement, but it also supports how I plan to argue that some battles were actually decisive, but not all battles achieve their expressed political intents. I plan to use this source to buttress my argument that certain battles can achieve decisive results if the context of the battle leads to decision on the political front. Therefore, this will be an excellent source for further research as the author writes on a similar topic, reviews battles in this context that I plan to discuss, and cites multiple sources that I can comb through for more parts of the annotated bibliography. In effect, then, I've done all of the pieces Professor Goldberg has asked for in my paragraph. I've written what is the source about, who is the author, what are the important arguments the book makes, and most importantly, as we said, how does this help prove my thesis / how will I use it? We go back briefly to our guidelines, which we'll pull right back up. If I can achieve that quickly and easily. That's always a question with technology. Oh, that's the sample bibliography again. Close, but no cigar. If we pull back up our guidelines, which we're now looking at again, we can see that we have the correct citation. We have the quality determined. We have the information about the source determined. We know why the source was selected because we've described why I picked it. We have any information that's useful about it. We have stated clearly and correctly why it's important to my thesis that I selected this work. We've looked at the conclusions reached by the author, and most importantly, I have said how I plan to use it to prove my thesis. Therefore, in just a jolly old 8 to 10 sentences, I've described every bit of this source. If I chose to write a paper later about this subject and on this basic topic, I would know what this source that I found earlier was, how to retrieve it based on its information, what the author is arguing, and then how it would be used in my paper. The goal for you would be to be able to write a paper later about it. The goal for me as your professor grading it is for me to know that you have found a source that will help you on your way to writing that imaginary paper. And so after just one basic and easy search in the catalog, I am 1/6, 1/8, or 1/10 of the way there, depending on what class you're in. And just like that, that's all it takes. I'm ready to move on from my number 1 to my number 2. So the question then for you becomes very simple. How do I find more sources? Where do I find more sources? And what are the best scholarly sources I can find? So for that, I'm going to show you a few more tips and tricks about the catalog that you can continue to use your research from. But in terms of translating it from the catalog to the page, that's all it requires. That's what an annotated bibliography is, and that's how to write a summary of an annotated bibliography source. So let's go back to the catalog. So when we left the catalog, we were looking at our source that we'd selected. We found one book. Now, we could do one of two things from this moment, and really at this point, it's up to you in terms of preference. If you wanted, you could go back to your original search list and continue the process. Now, one of the nice things about UofL's system is that you can actually sign in, if you see the sign in button at the top right, and you can save individual items. The way I recommend doing this, depending on what level of project you're doing, is to either save them like that or just to copy and paste them to a Word document and come back to them if you need them. If we want to, we can certainly keep scrolling because I'm already noticing that there are more and interesting books in this list that would help us. Battle, A History of Combat and Culture from 2003. Having read this book myself and knowing that this is what we're talking about, not only do we have a new summary that we could look at, I also know this book would be number 2. And I can repeat the process again. I can click on the item. I can see here is a summary that discusses these things. The author examines the relationship between the real and ideal, arguing that feedback between the two follows discernible paths. Battle rejects the currently fashionable notion of the Western way of war and replaces it with more nuanced concept of varied and evolving cultural patterns of combat. It sure sounds like this one would be pretty useful. I can do a little bit more digging, but by and large, I think I found my second source, and we'll probably want to repeat the process I used with part 1. First by citing it, then by summarizing it, and diving in a little bit more. So we can keep scrolling our original search term. We have, as we saw, 700 results. Future of war, a history. Questions about the future of war are regularly features of political debate, blah, 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 blah. Where should we look for new dangers? I don't know. This one looks a bit like it wouldn't necessarily help. It sounds like it might. It's a generalist history, but it's talking about the future of war, and I'm talking about something about political events that have already occurred and their reactions. So probably not useful, but sounds interesting. Carnage and Culture, Landmark Battles, and the Rise of Western Power. Sounds like a lot of different battles that have been picked, but I don't think that will be very helpful. And as I know from military history, Hanson's not necessarily the best one to pick anyways. We'll keep going. Not seeing a ton more. We're starting to see a lot more, again, individual battles that wouldn't help us. Kind of looks like we're running out of options. Well, this is where it proves to us that it's good that there are multiple ways to search things, and it's important that we think about how to search. One of the tricks I want to show you here is if we return to our original book, one of the most important things that we as historians have long discovered, and academics in general, I won't just credit us with this, is that there's nothing that beats browsing a shelf. And this is something I'm sure you all are well aware of from any time you walk into a library. Sometimes it's not the book you go looking for, but the one sitting right beside it that grabs your attention. This is the case even today, and this is the case in the digital age as well. As I mentioned, you might think, well, Professor, you said I don't have to leave my chair. Why would I have to go browse the shelf to find more answers? Aha! Well, my lazy friend, there's an easy way to handle this. You can actually just let the catalog do the browsing for you. If you were on any book that the University of Louisville owns, it doesn't work for books that we don't own because obviously they're not on our shelf, you can scroll to the bottom of the book result itself. So as we saw, this is our individual catalog for the first book we used that we know we liked and we know was useful to us. We scroll to the bottom, we can actually find this little feature that says browse the shelf. Now, once it loads up, we can see the books that are sitting on the shelf around it. This is the same view you get if you walked upstairs to Extreme Library Stacks and started poking around in the bookshelves. But the great thing is it actually folds in all of the different disparate shelf identifiers, whether they are necessarily physically upstairs next to them or not. In this case, we have something from the 3rd floor, something from the robot, another one from the robot, another one from the 3rd floor. So in a lot of ways, the digital shelf browse is even more useful than going upstairs and sometimes poking around yourself. The great thing about this is, as you might expect, the books around the book we selected are on the same basic subject and therefore might be useful to what we're talking about. So this very first source has not only given us its information, but it's given us its shelf mates, and we can look through those to see if any of them are useful. Now, if I want to scroll left or right, I can. We'll go left to start and see what we can find. What is military history? Probably too basic. Outlines of the world's military history, 1937, too old. 64, too old. Great commanders and their battles, not terribly useful. The Face of Battle, 1976, seems a bit old, but you know what? We'll click it and see what happens. Physical conditions of fighting, emotions, and behavior generated by battle. Nope, didn't work. That's not really on the big political question, so we'll keep scrolling. A military history of the Western world, 56, not too great. World Military History Bibliography, Pre-Modern and Non-Western Military Institutions and Warfare. Nothing quite necessarily as useful as a bibliography, but the problem we see here is there's no summary. Oh, there's just the contents. So either we could go get this book and hope it helps us, or if we don't want to, we can keep looking. Now, as we've seen, I could spend all day sorting through this, and I might find that's actually useful. The dynamics of military revolution obviously sounds like it would be quite useful. Again, a short summary, so I need to do some more digging. But one of the nice things that the catalog also does for us is that all books are sorted into big categories called subject headings. Now, these subject headings for us are really, really useful when we're searching for more books on the subject we're talking about. And this is a very useful way to keep searching without actually having to do whole new searches in the databases or in the catalogs themselves, because they're all clickable, as you can see. So if we want, we can click any one of these and see if any of the other books that are sorted into these subject headings might help us. For instance, we might pick, let's say we're talking about strategy and politics. Let's click strategy and history and see what pops up. Military strategy, a global history. That sounds very useful. 2020, you bet I'm going to look at that one. War strategy and history. Essays in honor of somebody might not always be useful. Not for something where we really are just looking for big books. American way of war, too specific. Strategy for chaos, revolutions in military affairs, and the evidence of history. Boy, that sounds pretty darn useful. And by this token, by looking through the subject guides as opposed to coming up with whole new search terms, we've already identified now 2 more books that would be useful to us in our citations. We can go back to the same process and begin all over again, the creation of a new citation. And by this token, we're already on our way to 6, 8, or 10 citations done, and we've only spent about 15, 20 minutes searching. Now, that doesn't exhaust the way you can dive into the library catalog. In fact, one of the most important ways you can dive into the library catalog is not to continue clicking subject headings, but to go back to your original search. Go back to our original search if we can do it, and play with the different phrases that might produce new phraseology. If we wanted to say where it says decisive battle, we could say strategy and battle and see what comes up. One of the most important things you have to think about when you're researching in a catalog is how does the verbiage of what your project, your thesis, your topic, how does that interact with the verbiage that the catalog knows? Because the catalog is not Google, it is not TikTok, it is not as algorithmically smart as you might think it is. It basically searches for what you ask it to search for and not a ton more. This has a lot to do with the specificity of academic writing. It doesn't want to do too much more than you're asking it for, which is why it has a lot of things that librarians call either limiters or delimiters, depending on what you're looking for. Strategy and battle in quotation marks under a keyword only returned us 10 results, libraries worldwide. That's not particularly useful to us, and that's a very small search. So if we come back to it, perhaps instead of strategy and battle, which are inherently contradictory terms, given that as we talked about in classes, depending on what you're in, we're probably talking about strategy and tactics, strategy and operations, or some combination of those 3 different pieces. So instead, let's come back to decisive battle and think about maybe instead of decisive battle, let's try decisive battles and see what that pops up in the keyword. Really, the more times you search, the more ways you limit the searching, the different search results you're going to get. I know it sounds like a silly thing to point out, but it's very important when you're dealing with a database as complex and as multifaceted as this, that you think about the ways of prodding the database into different phrases of your thesis statement. The more parts of the thesis statement you use, the more words you use, the more search results you're going to get, the faster you're going to get to 6, 8, or 10 sources. Now we see almost immediately there's a whole title we missed in the first search, decisive battle, 20 decisive battles of the world. This might be useful except for the fact that it says it's published in 1964, and really it's actually a reprint of a book published in the 1850s by Sir Edward Creasy. This is not a useful subject to us, but we can dump it anyways, as we know, by simply clicking the last 25 years. So our search results will change again. And just like that, we found an article from 2007, the concept of decisive battles in world history. Up to this point, we've only looked at books, but as I said, articles are a very useful thing as well. And this one literally describes the exact concept we're talking about. This article discusses the historiography of the concept of decisive battles and tries to explain both its popularity and its present eclipse. I think we found an article that really fits what we're doing. Let's go look for it. If we want to look for that, if we want to find it and therefore look at it a little bit more detail, as it's important to do with articles in the way that it's not quite as important necessarily to deal with secondary sources, is to look for that big green button that says view full text. It's not that you have to only view things that we have a full text copy of at the library, but it does make things easier. If we don't, you can always find the interlibrary loan button, and it goes the same for books as well. But here we have a nice easy one. View full text. We have 4 different databases that hold this article. You all spend, whether you know it or not, a crap ton of your all's tuition goes to paying for these databases, so I encourage you to use them. We'll click View Full Text. And the system will kick it around for a bit, trying to make sure that it hits whatever link it needs to hit, and there it is. Here it is, as mentioned, in the Journal of World History. Pretty sure that it's a nice reputable journal, published in 2007, so we know it's modern and useful. It's peer-reviewed, and here it is. Here is the whole text. If I want, I can even look at it physically in the journal itself by clicking download. Don't necessarily need to do that, given that it's already written out as is, but this is a nice way to look at it as well. And here we go. We have an entire article on the exact concept we're talking about. If we pay close attention, we can also see in the citations lots of other books mentioned in our own topic. One of the easiest ways to find more sources for an annotated bibliography is to let the sources tell you what they're citing. It's kind of like putting Legos on top of other Legos. Eventually, you're going to build one big old Lego. It's kind of the process of building a paper, standing on the shoulders of others who have started the process. And just like that, we have a new source that I know will work perfectly. Just like this, as we know, we need to cite it. Luckily, the articles in the database can be cited in a variety of different ways. As we clicked on this one, we can do the exact same process we found with a book. Here is the View Citation button. Citations load. There's our good buddy Chicago. Copy and drop back into our annotated bibliography. And just like that, what we've done with very minimal work, very minimal searching, is find a variety of books and a variety of articles that give us exactly what we're looking for in terms of what is required in the guidelines and what is the major piece of the project. The goal here is very simple, is for us to find those 6, 8, or 10 sources as indicated by your guidelines, to do the description of each source as predicated in the guidelines, and to go forward by following them step by step in describing each source. What I hope to impart most importantly to you here, other than the process of finding these things, is the way in which you will go forward in terms of describing them. But first, one last way of finding them other than using the catalog itself is to find them through the databases. As we just looked at with this article, articles can be a very important part of this process as well. Books are not the sole province of what you need to be looking for. Articles work just fine too, because they are by their very nature peer-reviewed as well. Luckily, the library makes it very easy for you to find the different sources and the different articles in these databases. As we saw from the main University of Louisville library page, all you have to do to find them is click All Databases A to Z. The primary 2 source databases you should get used to as history students, whether you're using it now or using it at a later date, is either through EBSCO or JSTOR. And the best way to find them is to simply click E for EBSCO, J for JSTOR. Here's the JSTOR database. Here's E for EBSCO. For EBSCO, the best one to use is EBSCO Academic Search Complete. As you can see, more than 8,500 journals are included in this. And as you can tell from the search systems, both JSTOR and EBSCO, as we can see, have the identical setup to the catalog. Essentially, it's kind of like a square and a rectangle. When the catalog itself searches, it's searching these journal or these databases as well. But when you're searching these databases, they aren't searching the catalog for books. So basically, these databases are really useful to you if you're looking for articles, but not looking for books, whereas the catalog does both. You might ask yourself then, why would I ever bother to use the databases? Well, they're just a little bit easier to use and a little bit more specific when you want to find articles to support you rather than books. So let's use JSTOR very briefly to prove our same point. Let's check decisive battle. Put it in quotes to make sure it searches just that term. And hey, you know what? That's the exact article we found earlier in the catalog. So we know, obviously, the catalog is indeed searching JSTOR. Now, here's an interesting one. The decisive battle of Ranelagh, prerequisites for decisiveness in early modern warfare. We mentioned that we weren't looking for specific books, or excuse me, for specific battles. We were looking for the overarching argument. But as you can see, the writer of this, James Ostwald, is actually talking about what would make a battle decisive. So maybe this one, despite not necessarily saying that, is useful. Another one. What's in a name? The development of strategies of attrition on the Western Front, 1914 to 1918. For a scholar working in this section, sometimes, as we know in history, the concept of the decisive battle, a big battle that wins things, runs into wars where that's not possible. And as if you've taken any of the military classes with me, particularly World War I is a good example of this. This sounds kind of interesting. If we click this, we might find that this kind of proves a bit about what we're talking about. We can see here that there's some indeed, we can click through, having some familiarity with this article, this is indeed something I would find useful for my thesis statement because it talks about why in World War I, the decisive battle was less possible. Ergo, it helps with our discussion, or my thesis's discussion, that some battles, some wars can have decisiveness for the cultural and political context in which they happen, and therefore some cannot. So, by and large, what we found by looking in JSTOR is a whole new wave of ways to look specifically into the articles of the database that would help with the project. The good thing about JSTOR is that JSTOR is kind of the historian's database, so to speak. It does lots of other things besides that, lots and lots of other things. But by and large, your average historian, when they start looking for articles, starts in JSTOR and then goes back to EBSCO as well. They're both great ones, and there's plenty of other ones you can use as well. But for a topic like this, where we're really just looking at articles and chapters and books that's related directly to this process in our guidelines, really what we're looking for essentially here is contained in EBSCO and JSTOR. You don't need to go bouncing around too many others to find it. But as we've seen and as we talked about, kind of the basic answer here is that we can do all of our work either in the catalog or in these two databases. So here's the takeaway. And let's I'll close this out because I've shown you the research side of things, how to look in the catalog, how to look into primary databases. And now let's go back and I'll share again the basic guidelines. If I can do that. Oh, did I mention? Oh, okay, this is actually working then. This is the sample annotated bibliography. What we've determined and what we've seen thus far from this project is, very simply, we need on the page the overall thesis statement that starts it, your basic information, and then a list of 6, 8, or 10, depending on what class you're in, Chicago citations, and the summaries of each individual source. As we saw in the guidelines itself, we know what's contained in each summary. We know, based on the bolding that Professor Goldberg has put in the guidelines to make it even more useful, we know what are the most important things in the summary, and we know exactly kind of what each paragraph looks like when it comes down to this. I'm not asking for you to write a 2 or 3 page paper per summary. Really what you're trying to do is in 1 or 2 paragraphs describe the source, describe why it's been selected, and describe how it would help you prove your thesis statement if you were to ever write a paper about it. One more time, do not write me a paper. Just do the required number of annotated sources. You will do very well on this project. As always, for whatever semester this happens to be when you're watching this, whether you're watching this in 2020, 2021, 2080, but I hope I'm not still teaching in 2080, that this will follow through for you, and you can always email me with questions or thoughts. One more, big admonition. At no point in time did we get on Google or Google Scholar to find sources. We were able to find plenty of things, more things than necessary for this project, simply by sticking with the U of L databases and catalog. Let that be a small lesson. Don't start there. It will not help you all that much on your project. You can do this project and get an A+ by following what I've just said and sticking with the U of L guidelines. So I hope this video was helpful, and I hope that if you have any questions, you reach out. Thanks.